All right, sixth graders, so what we're going to do is we are actually going to look at rounding our fractions to the nearest benchmark. So when we say rounding to the nearest benchmark, I'm looking at, are we closer to having none, half, or all of a fraction? And what this is doing is it's setting us up so we can estimate answers for all sorts of problems. So that way when we actually work into performing the operations, we have a better idea of what our answer should be close to. One way we can do that is actually by drawing out a picture. So say for example, we have the fraction 5/8. I could draw out a model and then color in 5 of those pieces. So now when I look at my bar model that I have here, I know that this right here is my halfway point. So if this is my halfway point, I can see I have just a little bit more than a half. So we would say 5/8 would be pretty close to having a half, but it would be a little bit more. Now, what if we don't have 5/8? What if we had something like 2/20? Once again, you could draw out the picture, or for your sake, you could use that online app that we have, and it's going to be a lot simpler because you're not going to have to sit and actually draw out each of these figures. It'll just create them for you. But if we're going to draw this out, we have 8, 9, okay. Now, not perfect, but I can still go through and get the idea. So now I've colored in 2 out of those. And if I'd count, right there would be my halfway point. So if this was my candy bar, I would see that I had almost none of it. So 2 out of 20 would be closer to having 0 than anything else. This is a totally acceptable way to look at benchmarks. And if that's where you are, totally awesome. Go ahead and draw yourself a model or use that app like I said. However, if we talk about efficiency, then this is definitely not the most efficient way to solve these problems. So now we're going to work towards what is going to make our work even more efficient. So I'm still looking at, is it closer to having 0, half, or a whole? Well, let's go back to that first fraction we were looking at, which was 5/8. What we can actually do is we're going to take that denominator and find half of it. So a half would just be 8 divided by 2, which gives me 4. So 4 is my halfway point. When I compare this, I'm now going to look at, is 5 closer to 0? Is it closer to having 4? Or is it closer to having all, which would be 8? Here, 5 is 5 away from 0, it's 1 away from 4, and it's 3 away from 5. So 5 would be closest to that 4. So that's the other reason that we can say that 5 would be around 1/2. If we looked at 2/20, once again, I can take 20 divided by 2. So I'm looking at 10. So now is 2 closer to 0, 10, or 20? And remember, it's 20 because that's what our denominator is. So 2 is 2 away from 0, 8 away from 10, and 18 away from 20. So 2 is closest to 0. So that's why we would say that having 2 out of 20 pieces of pie would be pretty close to not having any. Now you might be saying, well, Mrs. Whitney, I know how to find the half of an even number, but what happens when it's a number that I'm not as familiar with? So like an odd number. So let's say, for example, you were looking at something that's out of 35, so we'll say 17/35. I can take 35 divided by 2. If you're not comfortable with that, since it's odd, 35 is between two even numbers. It's between 34 and 36. Well, half of 34 is 17. Half of 36 is 18. So since 35 is right in between, its halfway point is 17.5. So now when we look at that 17, it's not very far from 17.5. And that's why we can say that 17 out of 35 would be most similar to just taking half, or look like just half of a number. All right, so hopefully this helps. If you have any other questions, make sure you reach out to me. But remember, this is just setting us up so we have a conceptual idea of where our fractions are visually, because it's really important when we start putting things together, because we have a better understanding of how everything should look.